We usually think of entrepreneurs as being in the business world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Launching startups, disrupting industries, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But today, we're looking at a completely different kind of entrepreneur,
Yeah.
the moral entrepreneur.
Yeah.
This isn't about making a profit. It's
Yeah.
about shaping
Yeah.
our very sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. We're diving deep into the work of the sociologist Howard S. Becker, specifically his concept of moral entrepreneurs from his book Outsiders.
Right.
So forget IPOs and quarterly earnings, We're
Yeah.
talking about individuals or groups who actively campaign to define what's moral behavior
Okay.
and then push for rules and norms to enforce those definitions.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily about pointing fingers at villains, is it?
Mm.
Often these folks are driven by a genuine belief that they're working for the betterment of society,
Yeah.
guided by their own strong moral compass.
That's often the case, yes. They believe they're acting for the greater good.
But, well, as you can imagine, this can lead to some pretty significant social shifts,
Mhm.
potentially sparking what we call moral panics.
Right. That's when society experiences this kind of widespread fear, often really exaggerated, about some perceived threat to its values.
Yeah, and it can also result in, new laws being created or the stigmatization of certain actions or even whole groups of people.
Precisely. And Becker, he identified two key types of these moral entrepreneurs. First, you have the rule creators.
Rule creators, okay.
These are the individuals or groups who spot what they see as a moral problem and feel this strong obligation to do something about it. Think of religious leaders, activists, passionate reformers, maybe certain politicians.
The ones saying, this isn't right, we need to fix this.
Exactly that. They're the instigators, you could say.
And then the second type, you mentioned rule enforcers. Who takes on that role?
Well, these are the people who are tasked with implementing and upholding the rules once they're actually established. So think law enforcement, maybe regulatory bodies, educators, anyone whose job it is to ensure people stick to the newly defined norms. Their motivations can vary, Sometimes it's just doing their job, keeping things secure. Other times they might deeply believe in the rules themselves.
Got it. So for this deep dive, our goal is really to understand how these moral entrepreneurs operate, how they function in society, and what the real-world consequences of their efforts can be.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with Becker's core argument, because that really lays the foundation here, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. What's fascinating, really, is Becker's fundamental insight. He argued that deviance isn't some inherent quality of an act itself.
Okay. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's not like there's a universal list of things that are just inherently bad, right? Instead, Becker says, deviance is defined by how others apply rules and sanctions.
Ah, I see.
In other words, an act only becomes deviant when these moral entrepreneurs, and maybe others in power, decide it is and then enforce that definition.
That's a really crucial distinction. It means morality, in many ways, isn't fixed. It's actively constructed. And moral entrepreneurs are central to that construction process. They're sort of the architects of our social norms and laws.
Precisely. And to make this less abstract, maybe we should look at a really compelling example. How about the history of anti-drug campaigns in the U.S.?
Oh, yeah, that immediately brings some powerful figures and campaigns to mind. Tell us more.
Okay, well, consider Harry Anslinger. He was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics back in the 1930s.
Anslinger, right.
He's really a prime example of a moral entrepreneur, specifically a rule creator.
Okay, so what did Anslinger actually do? Paint us a picture.
Anslinger spearheaded this very intense, very public campaign against marijuana, and he went way beyond just talking about potential health risks.
How so?
He actively framed it as a major societal threat. He linked it directly to violence, to criminal behavior, and disturbingly, even to ideas of racial impurity.
Wow. Racial impurity, that's a heavy claim.
It is. And that framing, which was deeply rooted in the racial anxieties of that era, really shows how these moral crusades can sometimes be, well, weaponized. They can leave lasting scars on marginalized communities. It's a key insight, really, into the power dynamics involved.
So what evidence did he use for these claims? Was there pushback at the time? Did people challenge that framing?
Well, the scientific evidence was pretty thin, often contradictory, actually. But Anslinger was very skillful. He used these sensationalized anecdotes, horror stories, really, and he tapped into existing societal prejudices. His rhetoric got amplified by sympathetic media, and it landed well with a public already dealing with economic and social anxieties. There were dissenting voices, sure, but they were often marginalized, just didn't have the platform or power to effectively counter his campaign.
So he wasn't just warning about health issues, he was deliberately constructing cannabis use as this fundamental moral failing, a danger to society itself.
Exactly. And his efforts weren't just talk. Anslinger was instrumental, really key, in lobbying for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937.
Right, the Tax Act.
And that piece of legislation effectively criminalized and stigmatized cannabis use at the federal level.
And the consequences of that,
Yeah.
well, we know they've been huge and long-lasting. It's had a massive impact on drug policy, contributed to mass incarceration. So Anslinger, as a rule creator, really set off a chain reaction with these profound societal effects.
That's the power of a moral entrepreneur right there. It shows how one individual, driven by their convictions or maybe other motives, can set rules that ripple outwards with huge, often unintended consequences.
Yeah.
But Anslinger, I mean, he's certainly not the only example, is he?
Not at all. We've seen this pattern pop up all over the place. Think about Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD.
Oh, good example. Yeah.
Their campaigns were absolutely pivotal in leading to much stricter anti-drunk driving laws. And just a huge increase in public awareness about the dangers,
Absolutely. They really succeeded in framing drunk driving as morally reprehensible, a serious public safety threat. And that led to big societal and legal changes.
They identified a clear problem, framed it morally, and campaigned hard for new rules and enforcement.
They did. And interestingly, you could argue their success in focusing so heavily on drunk driving might have perhaps inadvertently shifted some attention away from other dangerous driving behaviors. That shows a potential unintended consequence, even from well-meaning crusades.
That's a good point. Then you have, say, pro-life activists. They've been central to the ongoing debates around abortion, working tirelessly to establish new rules and norms about fetal rights.
Their consistent framing of abortion as a fundamental moral wrong has definitely shaped public discourse and legal fights for decades.
And on the flip side, you could see environmental groups acting as moral entrepreneurs, right?
Right.
Campaigning against pollution, climate change.
Definitely. Pushing for green laws, raising awareness, advocating for things like carbon taxes. They're basically defining certain industrial and consumer behaviors as morally irresponsible because of the impact on the planet.
Right, the impact on future generations, too.
Exactly.
And even something maybe smaller scale, like advocates trying to regulate violent video games.
Yeah, they identify a perceived moral harm, especially maybe to kids, and push for age ratings, raise public concern about potential negative effects.
So all these examples, they really highlight why understanding this concept, moral entrepreneurs, is so important.
It really does. It sheds light on how powerful actors can actively shape our collective understanding of what's moral and immoral.
Yeah, it reinforces that idea that deviance isn't some objective fact, but it's often socially constructed by these actors.
And it helps us make sense of how moral panics can suddenly erupt or how broader cultural shifts happen over time.
And like you said, this isn't just abstract sociology. It connects directly to real-world stuff, policy, law, media, activism.
Exactly. And to really dig into the complexities, maybe even the pitfalls of moral entrepreneurship, let's look at a major historical case: Prohibition in the United States.
Ah, prohibition. Yes, a classic example of a society trying to legislate morality on a massive scale. Give us the historical context.
Okay, so early 20th century U.S., there's this significant wave of moral reform movements happening. And alcohol becomes a primary target for many reformers.
Why alcohol specifically?
Well, many people sincerely believed it was the root cause of a whole host of social problems: crime, poverty, domestic violence, even just a general decline in moral standards.
So who are the key players pushing for this? The rule creators in the prohibition movement.
The temperance movement was the main force. You had powerful groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, and the Anti-Saloon League leading the charge.
Right.
They argued very forcefully that alcohol was breaking down families, leading to moral decay, making workers unproductive.
And they had some pretty influential leaders championing this cause, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Figures like Francis Willard from the WCTU and Wayne Wheeler, who was a very effective lobbyist for the Anti-Saloon League. They were incredibly skilled at mobilizing public opinion and political action.
How do they frame it? What was the core message?
They skillfully framed alcohol not just as a personal problem, but as a fundamental evil that had to be stamped out for the good of the whole country.
And what strategies did they use to get that message across and push for actual laws?
They had a pretty sophisticated approach, really. They used religious arguments a lot, painting drinking as sinful. They lobbied politicians relentlessly at every level.
Mm-hmm.
They used media very effectively, pamphlets, posters, speeches, and they strongly appealed to Christian morality and even patriotism, linking being sober to being a good, strong American.
Okay, so those were the rule creators pushing the agenda. But we talked about needing rule enforcers too. Who were they during Prohibition?
Well, the main responsibility fell to federal agents, the ones tasked with upholding the Volstead Act. That was the law providing the framework for the 18th Amendment, which actually banned alcohol.
Right.
But local police were involved too, often under a lot of pressure from the public or parts of the public to crack down.
And how well did that enforcement work out? It sounds like a monumental task, banning alcohol nationwide.
It proved to be incredibly difficult, a huge challenge. Many federal agents and local cops were underpaid. They lacked proper training,
Uh-huh.
which unfortunately led to widespread corruption. Trying to actually control the making, selling, and drinking of alcohol across the entire country, it was just overwhelming.
So what was the ultimate result of this massive moral campaign?
Well, as we know, the 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919. The Volstead Act kicked in 1920, and that officially started the Prohibition era.
But it didn't exactly create a dry nation, did it?
Not even close. In fact, it led to some really significant and largely unintended consequences.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the rise of organized crime is probably the most famous one. Figures like Al Capone saw huge opportunity and stepped in to supply the illegal booze through massive bootlegging operations.
Right, the gangsters.
Exactly. Black markets thrived, speakeasies hidden, illegal bars popped up everywhere, especially in cities. And maybe most importantly, there was just widespread public disillusionment. Lots of people, even some who initially supported it, came to see prohibition as government overreach. Breaking the law became pretty commonplace, even for otherwise respectable citizens.
So the enforcement just couldn't keep up, and eventually the whole thing collapsed under public and political pressure.
That's pretty much it. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified. That repealed the 18th Amendment, and the Prohibition experiment was over. It really stands as this powerful example of how a moral crusade, even one with sincere intentions, can backfire and produce really negative outcomes.
So looking at Prohibition through this lens of moral entrepreneurship, what are the key takeaways?
Well, the intent initially was clearly about protecting families, promoting public morality. The framing strategy was powerful, making alcohol synonymous with sin, crime, poverty.
Right.
The tools they used were religion, intense lobbying, media influence, but the unintended outcomes were massive. Organized crime exploded, black markets flourished, lawlessness became common, public resistance grew. So ultimately, Prohibition is this stark illustration, maybe even a disastrous one, of how moral entrepreneurship can radically reshape laws and norms, but not always for the better.
And it really brings us back to that core idea, doesn't it? Moral entrepreneurs don't just influence society, they actively make the rules. They define who gets labeled as deviant.
Exactly.
But their actions, their interventions, can definitely have these unintended negative consequences, maybe even increasing the behavior they wanted to stop, or causing hypocrisy, or eroding public trust in the law itself.
Precisely. It just highlights how complex and, frankly, unpredictable it can be when you try to legislate morality on such a massive scale.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into moral entrepreneurs, it seems pretty clear that understanding this concept gives us a really valuable way to analyze how societies decide what's right and wrong and how they set the rules we live by.
Absolutely. It encourages us, to look beneath the surface of moral debates and ask, who are the individuals and groups actively working to shape our perception and our laws?
Yeah. And it leaves you, our listener, with a really important question to mull over, I think. How might this idea of moral entrepreneurs apply to the issues and debates you see around you today? Who are the modern rule creators, the rule enforcers, and what might be the intended and, maybe more critically, the unintended consequences of their actions as they try to shape our social and moral world? Definitely something to keep in mind as you navigate, well, everything that's going on.